Hello, everyone. Welcome to Not Your Average Goat. This is a show that celebrates all the shapes, sizes, and colors of diversity as well as adversity, while creating a space for authentic and vulnerable conversations that hopefully you find to be meaningful and relatable. Through these conversations, my guests and I hope to have an impact on dismantling deeply ingrained stigma and prejudice.
Instead of doing a suicide note, I thought it would be more personal to do a video. So I was drunk when I shot myself. I had decided 4 days beforehand that I was going to shoot myself. But when I actually did it, I was drunk, and I was living in a 2-bedroom apartment with a buddy from high school at this point. So, he wasn't home when I started making the video. I was making the video, and at some point in the middle of it, he came home, and so I stopped it, and I guess I never actually finished it. So I came out to the kitchen while he was cooking. And again, I don't remember any of this. I am piecing this together from what I've been told. Went out and talked to him. He was like, yeah, after I eat, I'll hop on Xbox or whatever. So I went back to my room. He finishes up dinner and goes back to his room. And then at some point, within a few minutes of that, he thought he heard a pot drop, fall somewhere in the kitchen or something. So he heard the bang, and it was when I shot myself, but he didn't realize it was a gunshot. He went out to the kitchen, didn't see that anything had fallen. So he knocked on my door, and I didn't answer. And he ended up opening the door, and I was slumped on my bed with my gun in my hand and obviously a bullet hole in my forehead. He ended up calling 911, and I was awake through all of that. I guess he said I started talking while he was on the phone with 911. His name is Connor, and I was like, Connor, help me. And I was asking for water a lot for some reason, which is odd because even for the first couple months of my recovery, I could not get enough water. I don't know if that's just what my brain needed to recover, and I don't know if they're correlated, but it was odd. So I guess I'm talking to him the entire time that he's on the phone with 911. The police and paramedics get there and take me to the hospital. I'm alert and combative the entire time on the way to the hospital, and asking for water. And they had to intubate and sedate me once I was at the hospital because I was combative, and they were worried that I was going to injure myself worse just with my blood pressure spiking and me trying to fight people. And looking back, it's probably because I couldn't see anything. I'm drunk, I shot myself in the head, so I have an extreme, probably the worst brain injury that you could have. And then now I can't see, and I'm deaf in one ear. My body was had to have been in total shock. So it makes sense that I was combative.
You half deaf, as a result, blinded. And I know that initially you were told that the blindness was going to be temporary, right?
I did. I shot myself between the eyes because that's where you are. Yeah, that's it. That's where the kill shot is supposed to be with a headshot. There's a part of your brain that sits kind of back in that area, directly back from there, deeper in your brain, called the medulla oblongata. And that's what regulates all of your autonomic bodily functions, like breathing and stuff, and your heartbeat. So it's supposed to be your off button. And so I shot myself between the eyes, and this is speculation on my end. I think I survived because the gun that I shot myself with was my concealed carry firearm. And so I had hollow points loaded in my magazine. And so that's what I shot myself with, was a hollow point. And essentially, hollow points are meant to break up upon impact and cause extra damage inside of body cavities, basically from the round breaking up in basically the back pressure that comes in behind those different fragments as all of these different pockets open up inside of your body, and then they collapse in on themselves. So I think what happened, I don't know how familiar you are with human anatomy, but like the structure of your sinuses back behind your nose is actually pretty complex. And there's several different sinus cavities there. And so I think when I shot myself between the eyes, that round hit my sinuses, fragmented, and then rode around the inside of my skull instead of entering my brain. So some of the fragments are up against my right carotid artery inside of my skull, and then some of them are inside, like on the inner part of my right ear, but none of it actually entered my brain. However, my sinuses were blown out, so there's obviously part of my forehead and my right orbital area. So those bone structures that got destroyed took the brunt of the round, or that's obviously what I'm guessing happened, because they were pretty much gone. A more standard round is a ball round, and it's just a big slug. It's called a ball round. It's not literally shaped like a ball, like an old musket round, but they mushroom when they hit. And like, I think if I had used a normal round, then it would have a normal ball round, then it probably just would have punched through my noggin. But I got lucky. So, like I said, all of my right orbital area and my sinuses were gone, and my right optic nerve was severed. And because that orbital area was gone, both of my eyes had ruptures in the back of them, and I have both of my eyes. But like that eye, like all of that musculature wasn't really attached to anything because the bones were gone. And I have severe nerve damage basically on the entire right half of my face, where it just kind of numbs. My left optic nerve was intact and was initially still alive. They thought that when I had my facial reconstruction surgery, that it would alleviate some of the pressure that was on my optic nerve that was intact, and so that I would get all of my sight back in that eye. Or not necessarily all of it, but that I would get usable vision back in my left eye. What actually ended up happening was that, so there's a little canal on the back of your eye socket that your optic nerve passes through, and it's just essentially a cable of nerve fibers that connect your retina to your brain. And all of the swelling inside of my head actually caused that nerve to lose blood flow, because it was restricting itself on the edges of that canal. So it ended up dying, and that's why I'm completely blind. It just died over time. But again, they had been telling me that I would get it back after the surgery. And then one day, one of the doctors, every morning, they would come do their rounds, and she was reading off her notes. My family wasn't even at the hospital. My parents did rounds pretty much for the first long bit, especially while I was getting stable, where one of my parents was at the hospital at all times. And I was stable at this point, so my parents weren't staying the night at the hospital or anything anymore. But my mom's best friend was there, and the doctor came in to do rounds, and she's just reading off her notes, and she's like, yeah, asking me the normal questions that they ask me every day. And then she's like, yeah, and so you're totally blind and will be blah, blah, blah. And just like kept talking like it was nonchalant. And I was just kind of like, what the fuck did you just say? And, she said it again. And then I just kind of stared in the general vague direction where I thought my mom's best friend was. And, like that same, like, oh shit, like just that gut dropping feeling. But I think it was, obviously I was in shock, but that's how it got dropped on me. Pretty overwhelming. But yeah, I remember that discussion and that point, and I don't kind of remember how the rest of that day went. I was so busy with physical therapy and occupational therapy and just normal therapy for mental health counseling and everything, that it was chaos every day while I was in the hospital.
I can't even imagine just having this dumped on you and just having your life changed in such a drastic way once again.
Yeah. And even so, I was at a private hospital at this point. This is the same hospital that I was taken to just, when I shot myself. So I was out of the ICU, but it was still a private hospital. So they didn't have any special services or anything. They were trying to, they didn't know how to deal with a blind guy. They didn't know anything about access technology. So no one showed me, I didn't know that blind people could use phones or anything, before I even found out that I was going to be completely blind. I had a Swiffer mop handle as my blind guy cane with a tennis ball on the end of it. And they kind of just showed me how to shoreline everything. So like they would take me out in the wall or in the halls, and I had it like a gate belt on, which is just a belt that someone goes around your midsection so someone can hang on to it so that you don't fall. And because I was so just unstable physically. And, you know, they pretty much showed me how to drag that Swiffer mop handle along a wall. And that was pretty much like my blind guy training while I was there.
That sounds so ridiculous, Zach. I'm sorry.
Isn't it? Yeah. And I mean, this is a legitimate and like nice hospital in a Denver suburb. And they had no idea what to do with the blind guy. So it was actually, while I'm recovering at this hospital and dealing with all this crap, like they had some random rehab place come in and talk to me, and this lady was, you know, telling me all these things. I'm like, hey, you know, we've talked to our board of directors, and these people we want to donate our care to you. But it wasn't a blind rehab center. They were just going to send me to like a general surgery rehab center. And same kind of thing. I would have gone there with my Swiffer mop handle and shuffled my way around the hallways. Like, they weren't teaching me Braille. They didn't know that blind people would use phones or anything like that. Nothing. So I was just sitting there all day and doing my PT stuff and like learning how to walk again and learning how to brush my teeth. And that was about it. They kept a bullet hole in my forehead open for like, I think 50 days. Or no, not 50 days. I was in the hospital for 51 days, so like 40 days. And they packed it with gauze twice a day. And then in the background this entire time, my dad's trying to get me in at the VA. And I was honorably discharged. At the time, I was service connected at a 70% disability service rating just for my hearing loss and my knees and shoulders being messed up and stuff like that. And I had never claimed my head injuries. So he got in contact with one of our congressmen. I think it was Jason Crow. And like the VA was just being ridiculous about trying to deny me care and stuff because I had never gotten fully integrated with the VA system in Denver. So at some point during that stage, while I'm still waiting for my facial reconstruction surgery, something comes through. My dad's able to get me transferred to the VA, and they took me over there in a blind rehab professional. So someone with a master's degree in blind rehab came in and talked to me and kind of laid down like, hey, so how are you feeling about the fact that you're going to be totally blind, blah, blah, blah. We're going to get you taken care of here. Also, by the way, like what did you like to do before all of this? And I told her, you know, I lift weights and I rock climb and I ski and I do all these things. I ride motocross. And she's like, well, just so you know, like, you're going to be able to do pretty much all of that if you want to, aside from riding the motorcycles. And I caught my attention and like, okay, you know, cool. I'm listening now. And so she told me about blind rehab and where I would be sent after I had my facial reconstruction surgery and all the things I was going to learn and how I was going to learn to use Braille and learn to use a computer again and a phone. And they started sending in blind rehab professionals every day as part of my rehab. So in between my OT and my PT and my mental health counseling and all these other things, that I'm getting lessons on Braille and I'm getting lessons on how to use my phone. And I got to try cooking for the first time, like on the spinal cord injury unit there. And the realization that, hey, I'm not going to be in a fucking nursing home for the rest of my life. I'm not. There was a conversation with my parents at one point that I said, you know, while we were still trying to process all of this, and in the Marine Corps, like the places where we eat food are called chow halls. It's like a cafeteria where we can go eat our food. In the chow halls on Camp Pendleton, all of the salt and pepper shakers on these tables would say like proudly made by the blind. And I told my parents at one point after we knew that I was going to be totally blind, I was like, I'm not fucking making salt and pepper shakers. And they're like, what are you talking about? And I was like, I'm not being one of those people. They started giving me tasks, and I would do the tasks, and I was working and developing my skills, and just kind of moving forward with it while I waited for my surgery. And just trying to do whatever workouts they would let me do. Yeah, I've got a bullet hole in my forehead still at this point, and I'm like, hey, can you guys get me on they put me on like a stationary recumbent bike, and they're like, yeah, we can do this for 10 minutes or whatever, but we have to watch your blood pressure and stuff. It was just, I was just doing stuff. Kind of jumped in wholeheartedly into trying to build some of those skills while I waited for my surgery. And I ended up having my surgery and all that, get discharged and moved back in with my parents.
I imagine for people like yourself, previously for others, especially if there aren't a ton of, if you've never really been around other blind or visually impaired people, that's kind of the picture that comes into your head, that there really isn't anything out there for you to do. You're kind of going to be just sitting on the couch, listening to a TV, and eating and sleeping and using the bathroom. And that's pretty much it.
At this point, right? Like before that, well, before I get transferred to the VA hospital and talk to this lady, her name was Pam Newton, and my parents were wiping my ass, like everything. I'm like, how is a blind guy supposed to wipe his ass? And so hearing that adaptive sports were out there, like that immediately became, okay, I'm doing that stuff and I'm going to get to that point. And that kind of just, that was my goal. That was what I was going to get back into all of that stuff. It's continued to play a vital role in my recovery early on, and even now, like it's such a big part of my life. And I can't believe that more people don't take advantage of those things. That's something I'm very thankful for, my veterans benefits. I mean, who knows where I'd be right now. Without my veterans benefits, I would have gone to that 10 days of post-surgery rehab with my Swiffer mop handle. And knowing what I've been able to accomplish since, and just the incredible family support that I've had. And I know a lot of people don't have that. I know that's another area where I was extremely lucky. I think I would have figured it out, but I don't think it would have been I don't think I would be as far along as I am, right? There's no way without those veterans benefits. And like I said, my family, I mean, those are two crucial resources that I've had that a lot of people don't have.
So Zach, kind of going back to the whole reason how you kind of ended up here, the suicide attempt, you kind of on the outside looked like you were doing well. Like you said, you're going to school, you're getting straight A's, you were working out. And so it can be really hard for others to know if someone they know might be considering taking their lives. So I'm curious to know from you, if there's anyone out there who might be going through a similar situation, whether it was military, found out their spouse cheated on them, got in a motorcycle accident, or, it could be a completely different experience that is getting them to this deeply rooted depression and they're considering taking their lives. And people may not know that that's happening to them because they look normal on the outside. Do you have any advice for them or for people who might be in their lives, just things to look out for?
It's talk. It doesn't matter who whether it's a family member or a friend, or you go find a psychologist somewhere, or you have to call the National Suicide Hotline, or for veterans, there's a Veterans Crisis Line. That's the same thing. You cannot hold that stuff in. That stuff, it eats at you. And you really, when you're in that deep of a depression, you're not in a rational state of mind, and you have to get that. It's you have to let people know. And I think, I touched on earlier, I kind of shut down after we went to marriage counseling and stuff, and it just was not fruitful. And the other help I tried to get while I was still in, and I stopped talking about it. And I think that's what really caught up with me, obviously on the alcohol on top of that. But those were not a winning combination. You have to talk about that stuff. And realistically, this might be an unpopular, I'm going to take a step back. My personal opinion on all of this is if someone is at that point and they're seriously considering it, you're probably like, I don't think there's a whole lot that you're going to be able to recognize. Obviously you can, the apathy was a big thing for me. My parents also noticed that I was a grumpy asshole. As a basically like I was living at home, rent free while I was going to school and stuff. And like a month before I shot myself, my parents actually kicked me out of their house. And that's why I moved into that apartment with my buddy, because I was just a grumpy asshole. And I was just, I was so like quick to anger. That was another thing with, and not like violent or anything like that, but just where I would turn into an ass, like say something to me and it rubs me the wrong way. And then I just kind of turn into a dick, and could be abrasive. And that was something that just kind of came along with the impulsivity after the motorcycle accident. But there were my behavior was changing, and obviously the alcohol kind of pulling away from things. But even my parents were at my house with my sisters the day before I shot myself, or at my apartment. They said that I seemed off, tired. Obviously I was working full time and going to school full time. Like I had a lot going on. So I seemed tired, and I seemed kind of agitated, but they didn't know, obviously, if they had, that I wouldn't be blind right now. Another thing that some people don't really think about is like the genetic history. You're like statistically you're predisposed to that if it's in your family. In my family, it's on both sides. There's suicide on both sides and murder suicide on one side. Like it's 3 generations in a row on my mom's side, including me, and then 2 generations on my dad's side. It's not to say that you're going to obviously try and commit suicide if it's in your family, but there's some link there genetically that you're just more predisposed to it. I think the big thing is just people need to talk, even though it's uncomfortable and you're going to hate it when you do, but it does. I mean, it took me like 2 years to start dating again after Allie, and that was with therapy and stuff. And I would get sweaty talking about it and miserable and pity party for myself, just, the natural grieving process that you go through. But you have to take that step to deal with it, whatever it is. It doesn't have to be a psychologist, but you can't, it's okay to not be okay, but it's not okay to just not do anything about it, because that's when you're going to get yourself into trouble.
I think that also probably speaks to just how common suicide is for veterans and people in the military. I imagine that there's not always the necessary support that most people would hope that they would have too.
Yeah, and a lot of that, something you hear very, very commonly, is when you get out of the military, you lose that camaraderie that you had. And I know something like specifically for me, when I was in college after I got out, I'm 22 years old, which is still super young, but I'm also in college with a bunch of 18-year-olds with no life experience. And just I've done all the stuff that I had done, and then was in the middle of a divorce and dealing with everything else. And like, you don't really relate to people. Your sense of humor is different, your life experience is different. And that's just another kind of contributing factor. And I know when I got out in 2018, the statistic that was touted everywhere was that 22 veterans a day were committing suicide. I don't know what the number is now, but obviously that number is 5 years old at this point, but that's a ton of people.
That's a lot.
It's sad. And it really is. I'm super open about my attempt and everything that has come with it before and since. And that's been a process. I didn't used to be open about it. But it's something that I think is important to be open about now, but it really is, because I am open about it. It's shocking how common it is, even like amongst civilians. It tends to seem that more often than not, someone has either been directly affected by it or knows someone who has. And I think society is getting better about talking about it, but it's such a common problem, and it's preventable, right? Like, and that's the sad thing, but I think that's why it's so important that we're having conversations like we are right now.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think you were talking about earlier how the mentality is, shut the fuck up, suck it up, don't talk about it. And I imagine that doesn't really help at all either. And so people come out of the military probably and that same mindset and then keep their feelings bottled up. So I think it's so important that you are sharing your story and hopefully others hear it if they need to hear it.
Yeah. And I mean, that mindset does serve a purpose in that job when you're working in that field. But obviously in terms of like longevity and health, like outside of work, that is not anywhere near a healthy relationship to emotions and dealing with whatever's bothering you. It's just not productive whatsoever.
What is that experience like for you when you go back to school?
I went back to school for clinical psychology, and really it was just kind of like with, having the goal of getting into some of my old hobbies again. Like, I need to get my life moving again. I don't know exactly what I want to do right now, but this is something that I can do. And this is a way that I can use what I've done to myself and what's happened as a way to help other people. I got home from blind rehab late 2019, and then I started school in the spring of 2020. And so I have basic JAWS skills and stuff like this at that point, which for those of you who don't know, that's a screen reading software that blind people use for Windows based computers. Alongside going to school, I started a blog just to make myself have to use JAWS and get better with it, because you come out of blind rehab with super, super basic skills that really don't get the job done, because the people who are teaching you how to use those technologies aren't blind and they don't use those every day. I've always been a strong writer, and so I started with English classes. Had no issues with those outside of for writing, research papers, trying to access any sort of peer-reviewed articles to cite and use as backing for your research papers. They're pretty much all inaccessible. So just working with accommodations for that stuff. But the crux for me was when I ended up in a statistics for clinical research class, and nothing about the class was accessible. Obviously, I had my textbook converted into a format that I could access, but anytime I tried to read, an equation, like for standard deviation, it would read the entire equation and blurt it out all in one go. And there was no way to view it character by character or anything like that. The homework platform that we used was inaccessible, and also so were the tests. So I literally had someone that was assigned to me for the class, be my eyeballs for everything. And so we would hop on Zoom. She would click buttons for me while I worked through things, and she read, data to me and stuff like that. I was really struggling with that for whatever reason. I think it's just been an adjustment from having had normal access to everything in my life for the first 23 years. Accessibility issues are so frustrating for me, because I do, like I mentioned earlier, if something needs to be done, I'll make it happen. But when things are inaccessible and I don't have the option to make it happen, robbing me of that independence for whatever reason just drives me nuts. And I actually, we took the first exam over Zoom with her clicking all the buttons for me. I got 100% on it, and I was like, fuck this. I want to drink. And I ended up ordering alcohol, and shortly thereafter, was back at the point where I was suicidal and actually self-admitted myself to the VA hospital because I was suicidal, to the mental health unit. And I was only there for 24 hours, basically to sober up and kind of make sure that I was stable. But obviously that's not the reaction to have to accessibility issues, but for whatever, that's how I reacted to it. Obviously I've been working on my healthy coping skills over the past couple of years, but that was a bit of a lapse, right? I kind of jumped into those old habits of like, well, fuck this. I'm just going to have a drink. My parents were like, hey man, like you really kind of need to consider like what this is doing to you mentally. Like, is it worth it? Blah, blah, blah. And so it kind of dawned on me and I started researching why some things are accessible screen reading software and why other things aren't, and found out that it came down to the code of the application or website that you're using. And so I decided that I was going to teach myself how to code so that I could create accessible software, and started teaching myself how to code in October of 2021. And here we are almost 2 years later, and Zanagrams just went live on the App Store on the 4th of July, and it is 2023. So it's been a long road to where we are now, but that's how we got here.
Yeah. I mean, you drop out of school and you decide to teach yourself coding. I mean, there are like maybe not hundreds, but there are tons of different coding languages that can do infinite things. Like, how did you even get started? And like, how did you even decide, like, I'm going to code a game?
I actually started in the wrong direction. So I was researching all of this. Obviously, I had never written a line of code in my life. And it's fun. Before I shot myself at some point after I got out of the Marines, because I liked video games, and I had researched like, okay, how do people make these video games? I knew nothing about coding, and I Googled it and saw what coding looked like, like a snippet of some code that I had no idea how to understand, and saw the symbols and stuff, and it made no sense. And I was like, okay, that looks like it sucks. I'm not going to do that. And then kind of left it at that. Just started Googling. Once I found out that it was code, I started Googling, and I don't remember how I ended up where I ended up at, but I found a programming language that was supposed to have an accessible game engine. And I just started reading tutorials online and coding. And it turned out to, although it puts out accessible products, the actual developer tools are not accessible. So I invested like 9-ish, 8-9 months into learning that language. And then when I went to try and, test some code that I had on an iPhone instead of on my computer, I realized like, okay, well, this isn't an option for me. So I took a step back and started researching again on the old Google, and, knowing, up to this point, the vast majority of the blind people that I had met, were all using iPhones. So I was like, how do you make iPhone apps? And did research, and then I started teaching myself that language, which is Swift. And I started actually teaching myself that language last August. So it was about 11 months from the time I started teaching myself Swift to the time that I finished Zanagrams.
So that's so awesome, firstly. But I'm curious. So Zanagrams is a wordplay game. So were you always like a linguistic nerd? Why did you decide on a wordplay game?
No, not at all. So there's the website that I actually used, and like the tutorials that I read through and followed along with to teach myself the basics of Swift is a website called hackingwithswift.com. I know when people hear hacking, they think of like you hacking computers, but that's actually, in terms of programming, hacking is a term that's not uncommon to be used for like, hey, this is how I kind of slapped some things together just to make it work. So this website is totally accessible, and this guy has a course called 100 Days of Swift UI, and Swift UI is the front end, like Apple's modern front end framework, which essentially is just like the capabilities of the programming language to create interfaces. So I followed along with those tutorials, and there's a couple of them over that 100 days that you can't do because Apple's developer tools actually aren't fully accessible. But I followed along with those, and while I was working through it, was just like, okay, what's something I can start with? And obviously text-based stuff is a great way to go for blind people. And word puzzle games, for whatever reason, kind of popped into my head. And I know I was aware of what anagrams are, but the only time I'd ever seen them, like, they weren't presented in a format that's really great to use with a screen reader. You know, you have to use the keyboard or something like that. And like, that's really just not a fun or nice experience with a screen reader. So I tried to think about how I could make that more enjoyable and also just kind of put a different twist on anagrams. And I ended up with the idea for Zanagrams, and I just kind of ran with it and continued teaching myself the more advanced features of the language in Swift UI as I went. And it's been, you know, like, now looking back, I could probably crank out Zanagrams in like 2/3 of the time that it took me to write this time. But that's because I was still learning, and I'm still learning, but my skills have greatly improved, obviously, over the course of the last almost year.
And so Xanagrams was released on July 4th of 2023. When you finally got that approval and your game went live on the Apple App Store, like, what was that feeling like for you?
Honestly, like, imposter syndrome set in, where I was like, okay, I have an app that's on the App Store, but like, is this thing going to work? Even though obviously I've spent so much time testing it on my own. Like, I knew it was going to work, and I'd had the beta, and the beta was successful, but like, okay, I have this app on the App Store, but like, now what? No one knows about it. And what do I do? And obviously I'd had some plans for marketing beforehand, but I mean, now it's a whole nother skill to learn. I mean, now I do own a company, right? Like, I started an LLC for all of this, but here's my product. Now, what do I do with it? And especially like I immediately reached out to those blind Facebook groups that I had mentioned, and then the bug reports started rolling in, and I was panicking. I was like, what if people start finding out about this and start leaving ratings before I'm able to fix this, then like everything's gonna go to hell, and Zanagrams is gonna fail, and all this time is gonna be wasted, and I'm gonna be a failure, blah blah blah. And all this is gonna be wasted time. And so, like I said, I put in like almost 70 hours that week trying to fix these issues, and I got most of them polished out. And then I was in Montana whitewater kayaking last week, so I knew I wasn't going to be able to work on any of that stuff, but I at least had it to the point where it wasn't like, it was mostly fixed. And it's just from there, especially now, I released the 5th update like 2 days ago, since Zanagrams went live on the 4th of July, and I'm pretty sure it's completely stable at this point. And that was the first like relaxing feeling that I've had, where I'm like, okay, this thing's been on the App Store for a couple of days now. At this point, I haven't had any error or bugs reported. I feel good about it. Now I feel confident about sharing the word, because before it's been like apprehensive the whole time, because I don't know, like, okay, yeah, like, I can't find any bugs, but someone's inevitably going to break this. And yeah, so now I finally feel accomplished, but it's, we're 3 weeks after the fact now.
That's awesome. Well, I'm glad you're finally there. And just to give people a little bit of a description, so Zanagrams is a wordsmith game, and you get clues, and then you basically have to try to, look at this like letter bank and figure out what the answer is, and then, put the letters together. Am I describing that correctly?
The game itself is broken up into different puzzle packs, and every puzzle packs can be themed or unthemed. And like, when you download Zanagrams and start playing, you start with one themed pack and one unthemed pack. And the themed pack that you start with is all themed around outer space. So when you open up one of those puzzles, there's 6 clues, and again, they're all related to space. And next to each clue, it tells you the number of letters that apply to the answer for that clue. And then, so it does that for all 6 of those clues. And then along the bottom of the screen in your little letter group bank, every one of those answers has been broken up into groups of either 2 or 3 letters, and they're all scrambled in together. But to add them to your spelling, you just tap on a button with different letter groups. And the game automatically detects when you've spelled one of the answers right. And then once you have it actually hides all of those letter group buttons that you use to spell that word from VoiceOver. Visually, they're still available for people who can see that are playing, but they're visible. It's pretty obvious visually that they're disabled. There's a line that goes through them and stuff like that. But so you can actually use the process of elimination to solve each of these puzzles, because by the time that you've solved each puzzle, every one of those letter groups will have been used once. And you can also use hints. So if you get stuck, you can reveal, the next letter group for one of those hints. And right now, so Zanagrams tracks the amount of time that it took you to complete the puzzle, and it also scores your performance. So when you initially play a puzzle, everyone is presented with the exact same letter groups. So that's like the official, like the competitive version of every puzzle. And after you complete that, you can replay every puzzle as many times as you want. And after that, they're all broken up randomly. So if you complete a puzzle and then come back to it a month later and want to replay it in that randomized mode, the game will automatically randomize it. And if you as long as you've given yourself enough time to forget the answers, the letter groups are going to be completely different than they were before. And it's really cool. So you can replay things as many times as you want. And at this point, so every puzzle pack has 10 Zanagrams in it, and every Zanagram has six anagrams in it. So there's 60 anagrams in every puzzle pack. And I'm just short of 1,000 anagrams at this point. So you start the game with 2 puzzle packs for free, and there's a bunch more available for purchase, ranging from, there's several unthemed puzzle packs available, which are harder to play because when you go into the puzzle, the 6 words, like the 6 answers that are in there, can be completely unrelated to one another. So you have zero context kind of like to pull from. Yeah, that's where we're at right now. It's totally VoiceOver accessible, but for people who can see, it looks and functions like any other app. So if you want to play it alongside family members and friends, you can do that. And I actually, as of this morning, am releasing a beta for low vision testers. I added some additional support to improve contrast throughout the app for low vision users. So because I'm totally blind, I can't test those features, but just trying to get some more feedback from our community, and I'll add those. And then, it'll just be writing more puzzle packs and stuff for the time being and trying to promote the app.
That's awesome. And I'll definitely include a link to the app in the show notes so everyone can go download it and give it a good rating and a review. But Zach, I'm curious, what's new on the horizon for you? Do you have anything in the works?
Yes, but it's honestly, I've started dabbling in the background with the next app that I want to make, but it's right now just everything's focused on promoting Zanagrams and getting Zanagrams going, because the key here in terms of my business plan is actually, even though the critical, my critical mission here is that I'm creating accessible games that everyone can enjoy, the real market is with people who can see. So I'm trying to get this Zanagrams in front of as many people as possible, and that's actually where ratings and reviews come into play, as it boosts it in the App Store search algorithms. But ideally, if Zanagrams gets in front of enough people who can see, then it'll get some traction and start to take off. And in a perfect world, I'll be able to hire other developers and then kind of set an example in terms of inclusive design moving forward and what companies should be doing in terms of making things accessible for everyone. Even as we speak, I'm working on implementing support for people who have mobility issues to be able to use Zanagrams with their voice. And if I'm able to really get Zanagrams out there and get enough supporters and hire other developers, then I would grow Dark Horse Game Studios to the point where it's a company that only outputs accessible apps, so that everyone can use it. And that's not yes, it is blind accessible, but it's not just for the blind. That it's literally for everybody. And so that's my kind of pipe dream here.
Yeah, you and I should have a conversation some other time to kind of talk about marketing tips too.
I would love that, because I'm so lost in the sauce right now. I'm just kind of I'm kind of taking it till I make it. I'm just reaching out to people all over social media and different platforms that I can find to like try and, especially I think my story is a key component of all of this. And I'm just trying to find people who will listen to it and then support what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, you have a lot of great components about your story. And speaking of which, so Zach, the last question I always ask everyone. My show is called Not Your Average Goat, GOAT standing for greatest of all time. I did steal it from the sports world because I'm a huge football fan.
Okay.
So I love to ask everyone, everyone I bring on the show, I kind of see as a not average goat, someone who people should know about, but probably don't know about. And so I'd like to ask, for you, who or kind of like what can be an experience has kind of been your GOAT in life and why?
Really, it's a system. And I think it kind of comes down to my support system and for different reasons. And I'm speaking on the fly here, so that's probably going to be a little jumbled, but I know obviously I mentioned with the military background and stuff, and my drive and different character traits that I have, I think I owe to my dad. It's just I'm pretty similar to him in those respects. I think both of my parents, in terms of how to, be and lead a family. Even though they deal with their own relationship issues, our family is a solid one. And like I said, it's a resource that I have access to that many people don't. And it's just that, we have it's the small family, but we're tight. And it's because of what my parents have done for me and my sisters and what they've taught me. And I think for what Kennedy, I watched and continue to watch Kennedy overcome with her own disability as she's grown up and as I've grown up. I think it's given me something to lean into to move forwards. And obviously I'm a role model to her and my youngest sister, Macy. And it's just one more thing to look at and be like, hey, these people she's doing it and I can do it too. And also there is a gentleman that I have become really close with, and actually is a big part of the reason that I first opened up about my suicide attempts. I literally had a discussion with him about like the fact that I didn't know what to tell people. This was on my first snowboarding trip. This was like 8.5 months after I shot myself. I couldn't cook or anything like that, but I was out there trying to snowboard. His name is Tidwell. He's another blind veteran. He has an insane story. He just summited Everest like 2 months ago, and he was also the first blind person to kayak the entirety of the Grand Canyon. And like people die doing that every year, and he's completely blinded today. He's ridiculous, but he's, in terms of blindness, as a role model and just another leg of my support system. I mean, he's been there. I've had some pretty rough things happen over the past couple of years that like we didn't touch on today. And him, alongside my parents and my sisters, have been there through all of that. And it's really, and he continues to be. And yeah, he's probably another GOAT that you should have on because he's ridiculous. But yeah, I would say he's like an additional family member that I've gained out of all of this.
Yeah, I would love to have him on the show. And I'm so glad that you had that support system. I think support is everything, because as you mentioned, you did have a slight lapse for that one day after your stats exam, because I can't even imagine, thinking about your situation before you went blind and half deaf, and then having all of that still be part of your life and then go blind and half deaf. For most people, I can imagine the suicidal kind of thoughts would come back and be even more intense.
I mean, they did, and they have come back, and I talk about them now. That's the big thing. Yeah. Actually, I was really suicidal while I was at blind rehab. And realizing like kind of what was in front of me and how much I couldn't do for myself. And then, like I said, when I self-admitted to the mental health unit, and even just at intermittent spurts, since losing my sight, I have since been diagnosed with major depressive disorder. So I get in these funks for no reason, sometimes for, long periods of time. But I'm on an antidepressant, and I don't think that's anything to be ashamed about. And the same psychologist that has been with me since I got transferred to the VA hospital is still with me. And I talk to her once a week, and in times of crisis where I've really been in a rough patch, like those long bouts of depression, I've talked to her multiple times a day, sometimes or every day. Just like, hey, I'm not in a good spot, but I'm talking about it and we're going to deal with it. And that's gotten me through a lot. And like you said, my family, again, I'm very fortunate, but it's been a conscious effort to address all this stuff head on and make myself uncomfortable.
That's the key, being willing to be uncomfortable. Thank you so much. And I can't wait for everyone else to hear your story and to start playing Zanagrams.
Not Your Average Goat is produced and edited by yours truly, with music by Sergey Quadrado and Anton Blazov. All content is copyrighted and should not be recreated, reproduced, or reused without explicit consent. Please visit notyouraveragegoat.org/contact for questions.